So complex econogenic harm identification as a first step towards redress. So the motivation for this work, which I've been working on for some time, comes from George Dimartino. I used to be a frequent participant at the Summer Institute for the History of Economic Thought, which started at the Public Choice Center at George Mason and then moved down to University of Richmond. And I saw George Dimartino discuss his then nascent concept of econogenics. And I had been interested in deontology and procedural justice. And I thought econogenics would be a good view to look at procedural justice and deontology. And I have an interest in subjectivism, individual self-determination, and self-actualization, things like that. And this idea of Dimartino and McCloskey have about complex psychological harm is subjective, meaning what I might find unfair or harmful, you may not agree. So as part of the Summer Institute, one of the themes there was this idea of analytical egalitarianism, where everyone is capable of learning for themselves what is best for themselves. And part of subjectivity is the ability to try and fail and learn from your mistakes, experiential learning. And Pert and Levy, this is a collection. The Street Poet and the Philosopher, Conversations in Analytical Egalitarianism, collected works of some papers that were presented at the Summer Institute. And in their introduction, they find observed differences are then explained by incentives, luck, and history. And it is often the vanity of the philosopher to conclude incorrectly that ordinary people are somehow different from the expert. So our starting point, our analytical lens is kind of Kantian in nature, in that we all have the ability to be self-actualizing, self-determining. And so our state of understanding of equality or understanding of the world is that we all have this ability, and that we should beware, public choice economics, we should beware of the self-interested expert. And Pert and Levy, or Levy and Pert, have a follow-on to part of their analytical egalitarianism conversation, which is 2017, Escape from Democracy, the Role of Experts and the Public in Economic Policy. And they give several examples of public choice economics experts then bringing harm. So the state, we know from Max Weber, 1919, Politics as Vocation, the state has a monopoly on coercion. And then through attribution, the state experts then gain this power, this monopoly power. Only the state, and again, operating from a framework of equality or procedural justice, only the state has ability to create legal hierarchies or special treatment under the law. And there's been recent research in this area, especially starting with the reactions to the 2007 reactions to the housing boom and bust. For example, Lindsay and Tellis call this new phase of history the captured economy, how the powerful enrich themselves, slow down growth, and increase inequality. And Holcomb calls this a period of political capitalism. So we're finding a lot of interventions preventing social mobility in today's post-2007 economy. So econogenic harm in our specific context, we're defining as the unintended or intended consequences of economists as experts making decisions for society rather than individuals making these decisions for themselves. So Dimartino identifies two types of econogenic harm: compensable and non-compensable harm. Compensable harm can be measured and those harmed made whole through cost-benefit analysis. Jonathan White, who I believe was a past president of the Association for Social Economics, as was George Dimartino. An example would be the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 in Great Britain, where they freed the slaves by paying, the government paying for the release of those slaves to the slaveholders. And then White uses an example in about the GI Bill. You get conscripted into the US Army, well then you'll have your college, all expenses paid for your college. But I'm interested in subjective psychological harm, where it's not measurable, or there's no cause and effect or direct, obvious ability to identify those harmed, for example. So this is adopted from Martino. You have repairable harm and irreparable harm. Under commensurable repairable harm, you can make monetizable redress, as in the examples I just gave, performing cost-benefit analysis. And then in incommensurable, in other words, substitutable goods, in this case, it would be monetary redress. But in psychological harm, you have no substitutable goods. There's nothing commensurable. And redress here under repairable harm would include apology, recognition, or honor, but we don't expect experts who have given a monopoly on their expert power to apologize for anything that they do which harms people. So we can call that non-compensable harm, and redress is unavailable or inadequate, and this is what we're talking about now. So here's Dimartino's an incomplete and usefully imprecise taxonomy of harmed or harmful conditions. And in the analysis that follows, I've identified, in my paper, I've identified 4 cases of econogenic harm, but for the purpose of this presentation, we'll just do 2. Degradation of the physical environment, becoming fearful, insecure, anxious, becoming ashamed, loss of access to valued goods, loss of genuine choice over valued goods, loss of economic opportunities, alienations from one's labor, output, or nature, loss of respect, recognition, or honor, and constriction of one's capabilities or feasibility set. So now I'll get into the specific examples which I've written up in the paper. And the other examples that we won't be discussing now, which I use in the paper, are about expansionary monetary policy or active monetary policy can create inequality due to Cantillon effects. For example, during the first 18 months of the COVID period, we saw extensive monetary easing. Well, since 2007, extensive monetary easing, but in the last 18 months of the first 18 months of the COVID period, you saw lots of easy money, and the stock market indexes doubled in the first 18 months of the COVID period due to all the monetary interventions, unprecedented monetary interventions. And then the other example that we want to discuss here is how trade barriers against green technologies then prevents people who want to purchase the most efficient and inexpensive and highest quality green technologies aren't able to do so due to trade barriers. So these, again, subjectivity, these are my examples. You may have your own. So fiscal policy. At the end of 2020, US government debt per person is over $81,000 per person. And then when you look at the contingent liabilities for Medicare and Social Security, that's over $200,000 per person. And I'd like to point out that this debt is passed on to those yet born and certainly not yet voting. So the psychological harm caused here is becoming fearful, insecure, anxious for future generations. So here you can see the debt today, debt to GDP ratio is the highest it's been since World War II. And it's continued, expected to increase due to the COVID interventions and the unsustainability of Medicare and Social Security. And then here's the GDP per capita, and you can see the debt per capita. And you can see the rapid increase since the 2007 interventions, and then more so today with the COVID interventions. So the solution to this expert-caused econogenic harm is balanced budgets. And here's an interesting caveat from White. Derek Parfit in Reasons and Persons note that future people cannot complain about the present generation's choices because without those choices, future persons might not have existed. The moral standing of future anonymous persons is thus in limbo. So I may or may not have a standing to have complex econogenic harm for those yet born or yet voting, but I choose to do so subjectively because I believe it's wrong to pass on debt, current expenditures now for votes now, and pass on debt to those yet voting to pay for those current expenditures. Okay, agriculture trade policy. Well, we've known that the US government has played a role in agriculture policy ever since the New Deal period. And under the WTO, there is non-tariff trade barriers, allegedly free trade, but in de facto not, because there's non-tariff trade barriers. And approximately 65% of sub-Saharan Africans are unable to grow out of subsistence agriculture. And in addition, our foreign aid programs dump subsidized surplus US agriculture goods in local markets as part of our foreign policy. And that distorts local markets and harms the ability to grow out of subsistence agriculture. So here the complex econogenic harm or psychological harm. And this is from the view of the Africans, the sub-Saharan Africans themselves. It's a loss of economic opportunities and a constriction of one's capability or feasibility set. So you might ask, what is my standing to say that this causes me personal complex psychological harm? Econogenic harm, well, that is because I used to work for USAID in French West Africa and saw the futility and elitism of our programs there. So I was psychologically affected while seeing the result of our programs, especially regarding food aid and trade protectionism. So more immediately, I'm ashamed of our policy towards African agriculture trade. And the solution is real free trade, like Hong Kong did after becoming independent, not content requirements and things like that, other requirements which are non-tariff, which prevent trade in actuality, as we learned from Elliott 2014. So identification as a first step towards redress. The subjective value, equality under law, first do no harm, treat everyone equal under law, equality. Then we have expert value substitutions, passing of debt, public debt to those yet born, discretionary subsidies and tax breaks for fiscal policy. Monetary policy, we have regressive monetary easing and discretionary bailouts. And in trade policy, we see the inability to grow out of subsistence agriculture and more expensive green energy technologies. So the solution is free trade, monetary competition or denationalization of money, and then balanced budgets. So in conclusion, we have shown specific examples of complex psychological harm induced by economic policymaking in the United States with implications for other polities. This harm is not redressable in monetary terms because it is not quantifiable. Although we agree with George Dimartino of the existence of this harm and that this harm is caused by economic policy experts, we disagree with Dimartino in that we believe this harm can be repairable. The first instance in redress of this harm is identifying this harm. This identification itself is an instance of reparability. Thank you.